Hello! So, today I will be talking about chapters 8 through 14 of Renegade's Magic by Robin Hobb. And this is a very interesting section. I really enjoyed reading it. I don't think there's as much to talk about as there was in the first 7 chapters. The first 7 chapters were so dense. This is a bit more of a sort of chill transitionary period in the book. Literally a transitionary period. It's literally a journey from place to place. As Nevare, Olekea, and Likari journey to the Speck's trading place and wintering place in the far east of the continent. However, along the way, there are several things that get some things get revealed and some other stuff just sort of develops naturally between the characters. And there's a few things I want to talk about here. And I'm going to start with sort of the most important, I think, for this book as a whole, and the one that gets the most attention during this section of the book, which is the complex relationship between Nevare and Soldier's Boy. So, a lot of the stuff that I sort of felt was implicitly stated in the first section of the book is made more explicit here. So, for example, the usage of the first versus third person to refer to Soldier's Boy gets explicitly called out here. Namely, Nevare realizes that he doesn't always know whether he thinks of Soldier's Boy as himself or not. And that is reflected in the grammar of the book. The text sort of seamlessly switches, sometimes even within the same paragraph, between referring to things that Soldier Boy does or feels or thinks in the first person and in the third person. And this is one of those decisions that I am just in awe of Hobb's confidence, that she is just willing to go with this, to do something so unconventional. It's very it if you aren't paying attention, it feels like a mistake. It feels like a mistake in the writing. It didn't to me because I was paying attention and I did like immediately pick up on what was going on here. But I'm reminded again of the first book and the extremely bold choice by Robin Hobb to make Nevare boring on purpose, to just write a book with a boring protagonist, but like do it to make a point and to set up future developments. These there's just constantly throughout this trilogy there are creative choices made that are made only in service of creating a more interesting and more compelling work of art, and not necessarily in the service of making the book more accessible to readers or making the book more approachable or anything like that. And I have a huge amount of respect for that. And this sort of first, second person shifting that happens between Nevare and Soldier's Boy is definitely one of those choices. And once you're aware of it, you can sort of track the relationship between their two identities within a scene as it fluctuates, because it often does. You can see that when Soldier's Boy does something that is more like something Nevare would do, they drift closer to each other, and Nevare slips into first person, and then he slips back into third person as Soldier's Boy starts acting in ways that are more alien and off-putting to Nevare. And also, if Nevare is comfortable, if Nevare isn't actively thinking about the divide between himself and Soldier's Boy, it is easier for him to slip into the first person narration again. Which is all just really, really a really good way, a really good subtle way to communicate that relationship and the way it develops over time. Um, but what we get in this section is something that's even more interesting than that, which is that Soldier's Boy and Nevare start directly talking to each other. There's several parts here where they are directly talking to each other, and there's still a lot of hostility there, but they both seem more open to at least acknowledging each other, and sometimes, sometimes Nevare will give Soldier's Boy advice, and Soldier's Boy will often respond to Nevare's questions about what Soldier's Boy is doing, even though he doesn't have to. Um, which which I really like. I like this sort of tense, almost rapport that they've built up. Like they still, Nevare would still very much prefer if Soldier's Boy didn't exist, and I'm sure Soldier's Boy would prefer if Nevare didn't exist. But it seems like they've both sort of settled into a sort of temporary acceptance of the other's presence, and are at least willing to negotiate, as it were, even though Soldier's Boy ultimately is the one making all the decisions. And here we also get some very illustrative bits of dialogue from both of them about their relationship, especially from Soldier's Boy, because we haven't really been able to hear directly from Soldier's Boy over the previous two books. We've only gotten sort of vague hints at his feelings. But here he says to Nevare very early on in this section, "You used it all. Did you hate us that much, or were you just stupid? I saved that magic. I hoarded it all, thinking that I might get one chance, and now it's all gone. You always complained to everyone who would listen that I'd stolen your beautiful, wonderful future. Is that why you destroyed mine? Was it vengeance or stupidity?" And it makes sense that he would view it this way, because of course, as because of course he did do the same to Nevare. He did, like he says it here mockingly, but he literally did steal Nevare's future. Nevare had a future all planned out for him, and he was excited for it, and it was completely destroyed by the intervention of Soldier's Boy. So while we know, because we've been in Nevare's mind, we know that Nevare genuinely thought he was doing the right thing for the Specks when he used up all his magic. We know that he had absolutely no, vengeful intentions. It makes perfect sense why Soldier's Boy would think he would. The other thing that's interesting here is that Soldier's Boy talks about how while he was within Nevare, he was able to do things that Nevare doesn't know about, aside from stopping the dancing spindle. Because stopping the dancing spindle was something that Nevare very much did realize was Soldier's Boy's work. But Soldier's Boy here says, "Even now, I do not think I would be wise to tell you the things the magic prompted me to do. There were small things that I did, things that made no sense to me, but I did them. And I kept them from you, lest you try to undo them." And that makes me wonder how much of the various mishaps and tragedies that struck Nevare's life over the course of the entire second book, how much of that was the magic abstractly intervening in his life the way I was thinking, and how much of it was actually Soldier's Boy using his own magic as, through Nevare's body? I'm wondering, for example, the most extreme example I can think of, did Soldier's Boy somehow trigger the outbreak of the Speck plague that hit the Burvell estate? Did Soldier's Boy kill the Burvells? Did he play a part in Nevare being accused of all those crimes in Geddes? I don't know. I I would have to go back and reread. I'd have to go back and reread the second book to try and see if I can pinpoint moments that feel like it's like they are Soldier's Boy taking control of Nevare's life. Um, I'm curious to see if this book will actually give us actual answers, or if we're just sort of meant to, guess what he did. Either is fine for me as far as I'm concerned. Um, Another thing that's interesting here is the matter of what part of Nevare is Soldier's Boy. So Nevare at one point wonders, because Soldier's Boy and he share the same first 15 years of their lives, right? Like everything up to the moment when Nevare went off with Duara is their shared life. They had the same memories. That's where they split. So and presumably at the moment of their split they were the same. So Nevare is looking at Soldier's Boy and he is identifying aspects of himself that he is now missing because they were taken from him by Lysana and turned into Soldier's Boy. And in particular, he's thinking about sort of Soldier's Boy's callousness and sort of brutality sometimes that he has, his ruthlessness. And he wonders, if he had stayed a part of me, would I have been capable of such deadly traitorous acts? Or would the self that I was now have ameliorated him, balanced his warlike nature with more ethics and philosophy? Was he a better soldier than I was, in that he was burdened only with loyalty to his people and cause? Was he the sort of soldier my father had wished me to be? And actually, yes. In a way, yes. Soldier's Boy's loyalty is obviously to a completely different faction than Nevare's would have been, but I do think that maybe Soldier's Boy got a lot of the sort of discipline and determination that Lord Burvell spent the first 15 years, sometimes literally beating into Nevare. I do think that there is very much a lot of the young Nevare in the man that Soldier's Boy now is. And Soldier's Boy actually has his own side of this, which is that he feels kind of weird about Nevare's family. When Nevare's father is brought up at one point, Nevare realizes that Soldier's Boy has a lot of very complicated and mixed feelings about Lord Burvell, just like Nevare does, because that's his dad as well, not just Nevare's. The first 15 years of what I would consider to be an abusive childhood, although Nevare might disagree, that happened to both of them, and they both have those memories, and they're both shaped by them. And another thing that's important is how this will impact Soldier's Boy's ultimate actions against the Gyrnians. You see, Soldier's Boy was raised in a well, first of all, a racial supremacist society, which is what Gyrnia is, and a colonialist empire. And as a result, he was taught to view all other people who are not Gyrnian as lesser, as not worthy of consideration as human. If you remember how the Plains people and the Specks were talked about by Gyrnians in the first book, Nevare, and by extension Soldier's Boy, were both taught to dehumanize others. However, Soldier's Boy is now on the other side, and I think Soldier's Boy doesn't view the Gyrnians as really human, because he views them in the same way that they view the Specks and the Plains people. He has a colonizer's mindset that he was raised with, this dehumanizing imperialist worldview, and he is now turning it against the colonizer. And in a way, there's poetic justice in that. The fact that the weapon that the magic forged to fight against Gernia is actually just having someone who will look at the Gernians the way that Gernians look at everyone else. Um, of course, I don't want that to happen because I don't think that will lead to a good solution to this situation. But there is something, like I said, something poetic about that. Now, there's also the question of Nevare potentially surrendering to Soldier's Boy, dissolving into him. And he seems to, first of all, Nevare talks about this like it's something that he can do at will. Like, if he wants to, he feels like he can simply choose to cease existing. So that means that he's sort of actively maintaining himself as a separate entity. And if he wanted to, he could just meld into Soldier's Boy. And presumably Soldier's Boy could do the same in the opposite direction. Thereby making either one of them whole at the expense of the other's existence as a separate entity. And he views this as a potential solution. He actually considers that if he were to meld into Soldier's Boy, to make Soldier's Boy a whole person in the way that neither of them currently are, then maybe his own sort of attachment to and feelings about Gernia would serve to temper Soldier's Boy's righteous rage against Gernia, which I'm not sure that that's necessarily what would be the best. Like, I feel like that might inhibit, like, on the one hand, it would prevent Soldier's Boy, I think, from taking too drastic of a measure that might result in more harm than is necessary. But on the other hand, it might stop him from doing what is necessary to prevent the colonization of the Speck lands. So I still don't know where the book is going in that regard, although like, there is no way that at the end of this book, Soldier's Boy and Nevare will both still exist as separate entities. I think either one of them will quote unquote die and the other will be left to exist as an incomplete person, essentially, or they will fuse back together into one coherent entity, and that entity will probably be more like one than the other of them, although I'm not sure who. And that brings us to the second thing I want to talk about, which is Orangula, the god of death. Orangula shows up again here, and he makes it very explicit that as far as he is concerned, he doesn't see the difference between Nevare and Soldier's Boy. Like, technically, Nevare was the one who owes him a death, but Orangula doesn't care. Like, as far as Orangula is concerned, he says that either one of them can pay him back. He doesn't see a difference. Which is also interesting. It makes me wonder, because of course, Orangula has probably an awareness of sort of the magical realities of this world. It kind of makes me wonder if the Soldier's Boy Nevare distinction is more of a, like, psychological split than necessarily a magical one. At this point. I wonder. Like, what if at the end of the first book, the magical split was resolved when Soldier's Boy was reincorporated into Nevare after Nevare cut down Lysana's tree? But the fact that Nevare now has these two conflicting sets of memories essentially created a personality split inside him that at this point is more just a psychological split rather than a true sort of mystical split of his soul. I'm also not sure if these things would necessarily be any different. I'm just sort of wondering aloud here. But Orangela uh, seems to imply that he wants Likari as the sacrifice, and that terrifies me. I don't want anything to happen to Likari. Likari is adorable. Don't hurt Likari, he's just a little boy. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope that the sacrifice ends up being Nevare himself, or Soldier's Boy himself in some capacity, and not someone close to them. Because I feel like Nevare has watched enough people close to him uh, suffer and die because of him. I hope that that's over. I hope. But it probably isn't, because that has always been the result of Nevare denying what the magic wanted from him. And now that Soldier's Boy has taken over, he is no longer denying what the magic wants from him. However, he is denying what Orangela wants from him. And for all we know, Orangela might be an equally powerful entity as whatever the Speck's magic is. Of course, a part of me is still not actually sure that Orangela is real. I do have to keep reminding myself, so far, we haven't gotten hard evidence that Orangela exists outside of Nevare's head. I think he does. The scene where Soldier's Boy yells at a bird and Likari is very concerned about it seems to imply that he does, because the bird doesn't act like a normal bird. Like, it doesn't seem to respond in the ways you would expect it to like a grown man yelling at it for a start. But it does respond in the way you would expect it to Likari, like, waving a stick at it. So I don't know. Like, there's still a part of me that thinks, what if Orangela's just a figment of Nevare's imagination? I don't know. But if we assume that he isn't, his presence in the story intrigues me, because, like, just on a sort of on a Doylean, from a Doylean perspective, his introduction to the story feels super out of left field. Like, he is so far not a part of any major plot theme that this book has. He's just kind of this additional thing. And this isn't a criticism. I think that's fascinating. And Hobb has definitely gotten my trust as regards and so I completely trust that she's doing this for a reason. So whatever the hell Orangela is, I'm sure he's there for a reason. And that brings us to the third thing I want to talk about, which is Speck culture. We learn a lot more about the Specks and their way of life and their culture in this section, starting with the absolutely massive revelation, which when I read it, I immediately knew would end up forming like a cornerstone of my analysis of this series in my dissertation when I end up writing it. The Speck skin markings aren't naturally occurring. They're tattoos. Like, they're a bit more than tattoos. Like, they kind of poison themselves and then go into a fever, and like the skin sort of scabs over and creates the markings. But still, like, that's not genetic. The markings are not genetic. That's a huge thing for me. And also, the sun sensitivity is also not genetic, because Nevare now has it. Like, the sun now burns Nevare. And presumably that has to do with the markings. Like, presumably the markings themselves make your skin more sensitive to the sun. So basically everything that sort of marked the Specks as being potentially biologically distinct from other humans has now been proven to not be the case. So the Specks are not in any way a fantasy race. They're just a race of humans. Um, which is an interesting revelation to me. It makes me wonder. Well, first of all, it makes me wonder how the great men work, because the great ones, because clearly the magic up until this point has only ever selected Specks as its vessels. At least everyone seems to agree that Nevare is the first great one who is not a Speck by birth. So, like, why would that be the case? Why were only Specks susceptible to magic until now? I don't know. um, it's I'm waiting to see if we learn more about like the origins of the magic and how it relates to the Specks, or if it's just gonna remain a mysterious like force of nature. Yeah, the other things that we learn about the Specks, we learn a lot more about their trading practices in the final chapter here, about the trading place, which I do find interesting, especially the way that Olikea trades the fertility figurine to this old woman for a bunch of stuff. Or rather, she doesn't trade the fertility figurine. She makes a deal with her that they together will essentially rent out the figurine to other women. There's a lot in the whole trading chapter that I find very interesting from an anthropological perspective. I think it's very clear that Robin Hobb has read a bunch of anthropological work on sort of the ways that trade works in various cultures around the world, especially in barter systems, and especially in systems where gift giving is actually a form of trade that's sort of disguised as gifts. So that was interesting to me, but I don't have much original to add to it other than it's really well depicted here. The relationship between Olikea and Likari is developed a bit more, where we now really see that what originally seemed like Olikea being like a horrible, neglectful mother is really more a case of the Speck culture not really having the role of mother in the way that we think of it. Like Likari calls her Olikea. He doesn't call her mother. And Nevare asks him about this at one point. He says, "Do you never call her mother?" And Likari says, "A mother is what she is, not who she is." So it's not seen as like this primary identity for her that she needs to fulfill for the rest of her life, the way that our society treats parenthood and especially motherhood. And that makes sense because child rearing is communal for the Specks. That's another thing that's very much based on a bunch of real life cultures, where child rearing is very much left up to the clan or the village or the town or whatever as a whole. You know, the old "it takes a village" adage, but taken to its extreme. And likewise, while she doesn't she doesn't really treat Likari with a lot of love or affection the way we would see it, she does treat him with a lot of respect. She treats him as a fellow person. He is our society as it exists right now, and Guernian society as well, which is heavily based on our Western civilization, has a huge problem with the dehumanization of children. Children do not have legal personhood, really, in our culture. They are not seen as people, really, until they are adults. We treat them as possessions almost, and certainly not as people capable of making their own decisions. And Likari is not treated that way. Likari is treated as his own person who is able to make his own decisions. And sometimes those decisions are bad, and he gets to live with the consequences of that. But he is definitely not seen as in any way, in any capacity, even sort of symbolically, his parents' property, the way that children often are in our and Guernian society. Like, there is no scenario in which Olikea would view Likari as a disappointment the way that Nevare's father does, or think that it was that she had a right to demand that he live his life the way she wants him to. Again, the way Nevare's father does, or Epini's mother, for that matter. So once again, we're seeing the Speck Society being shown in sort of both its positive and negative aspects. There's a few more interesting things here in the dream walking sections. Nevare talks to Epini a couple of times. There's a great line here that I think is my favorite line about Epini, which is Epini radiated herself like a fire radiates heat, which I really like as a description of Epini, and I think it's a great description of her. She has this intense presence, this intense Epininess, as it were, that sort of radiates out from her whenever she's on the page. And it's depicted really well in scenes that she's in. It's very much been shown to us before it was told to us in these words. So that's something I really appreciate about her, and it's part of why she's my favorite character. But during one of those conversations with Epini, I do just want to note that Nevare says something really stupid, which is that Epini says, well, the Guernians are very much the bad guys here because we are the ones who attacked the Specks first. Like, the Specks are fighting back. We're the ones who started this war. And then Nevare goes, oh, well, that doesn't matter because the Specks once also colonized the Kidona and drove them out of their lands and stole their resources. And, like, no. The fact that the colonized population at some distant point in the past were themselves colonizers against a different unrelated population does not in any way impact the moral realities of the current situation in which the Guernians are the undisputed antagonists of this relationship. Nevare, please. Please, Nevare. Be reasonable. So that was stupid of Nevare. And the other thing that's interesting here is that once they get to the trading place, Nevare sees a bunch of Guernian trade goods being traded by the Specks to various peoples from across the sea. Essentially, the very peoples that King Trovan wants to trade with. Like, the road exists so that the Guernians can trade, can establish a trade route with the peoples of the East. And unbeknownst to them, they have one. They've already established trade with the peoples of the East. They've just established it by proxy through the Specks. And now I'm wondering if that's going to end up being the resolution of this story. Like, if this story is going to have any kind of neat, happy ending of any kind of compromise between the Specks and the Guernians, which I still don't think is possible, but if it could be possible, the one way I can see it happening is with the Guernians basically apprenticing the Specks as their trading partners and their proxy to the East. So that rather than the Guernians having to cut a road through the forest, they can just trade with the Specks, and then the Specks trade with the East. And then the Guernians profit when the Specks bring back stuff from the East, and so forth. Which I doubt the Guernians would go for, because it would be less profit overall for them, because they would have to share the profits with the Specks. But a man can dream. And finally, I want to say that there is at one point, Nevare and Epini talk about the idea of reaching out to the Queen of Guernia because she believes in magic and she might be more open to sort of acknowledging the ancestor trees and that whole situation as relevant to the road's expansion. And they dismiss the idea because they're like, oh well, a penny can write a letter, but will the queen even care or whatever? And how can you prove it and so forth? But it's weird to me that they don't acknowledge what to me seems like the really obvious solution, which is that Nevare should dream walk into the queen's dreams and talk to her and influence her directly. She will believe that something magical is happening if she has a personal encounter with a supernatural entity, which is what Nevare basically is. I feel like that's an avenue that is unexplored here and that really should be occurring to both Apini and Nevare as a possible solution to this situation. Um, yeah, I think that's there's a bunch of more stuff in my notes here. I took a lot of notes this time. I didn't talk about the sort of revelation that Lysana imparted a bunch of her memories to Soldier's Boy, which is really interesting to me. Um, but this video has gone on long enough, and I've hit the sort of the main points that I wanted to in this section. Um, I will go and keep reading this fascinating book, and I will see all of you hopefully next week for another section where I suspect we will probably get to see Nevare slash Soldier's Boy actually try to make his claim to the Specks and try to establish authority over the Specks, and presumably we will finally meet Kinrove, and Soldier's Boy will come into some sort of conflict with Kinrove. That's my guess for where the story is going next. Okay, see you all next week. Bye.